Sağlık emekçi olarak sizden merak ettiğimiz en çok şu. Bir Kolombiya'daki barış süreci nasıl işledi? Gerek içerik olarak gerek zaman süresi anlamında ve sağlık emekçilerini, sağlık kurumlarını nasıl etkiledi? Buradan çıkartacağımız dersler ne olabilir diye genelden özeli bir paylaşım bekliyoruz sizlerden ve sonrasında da muhtemel sorularımız olacaktır. Arkadaşlarımızın sorularıyla bir interaktif bir görüşmeyi devam ettirmeyi istiyoruz. Süre konusunda çok büyük bir sıkıntımız yok. Yani siz dinlemek istiyoruz. Yani orada zaman açısından 40 dakika bana yeterli demiştiniz. 40 dakika aşabilir deyip size sözü vermiş olayım.
Hello, Rosbash, merhaba. It's a pleasure to be here. Is everything working well? Can you understand me? The translation is working fine from my end. Thank you again, and it was wonderful to be in the previous conference, in the previous meeting, to hear different voices. And in fact, I have not left that place, and I'm very interested and very grateful to Ata Sawyer and to all of you for this initiative. I believe it's very, very important nowadays, not only to maintain these networks, but to make them grow and to exchange and to be critical and self-critical in a very difficult context. I will begin by making a very brief introduction of myself, and just with a warning. Given the distance and the opportunity to meet, I would like to provoke an exchange and a discussion. I think the part where we can talk, answer questions, discuss points of view is the most important component for us as well, because I will be sharing your points of view, your perspectives with other people in our environment, in the Americas, not just in Colombia. So I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say and what you have to tell me actually about what is going on with the peace process there, as far as you know. I have been trying to follow it, and I have been in contact with people in different places, particularly Kurdish friends, to try and understand what is happening, but it isn't easy. It's difficult. My name is Manuel Rosenthal. I'm born in Colombia. That's the first clarification I want to make. Many of us don't accept Colombia. Like many of you wouldn't accept many of the countries in the Middle East the way they have been designed, we don't accept Colombia. The name Colombia comes from Christopher Columbus, and Columbus was an invader. He destroyed our histories, our ancestors, our past, and he represents the right of conquest. In other words, the mechanism by which, through violence, a territory can be occupied and thereafter transformed into a nation state in order to attempt to legitimize what has been conquered by destruction and oppression. So Columbus and Colombia is a name that we don't accept. We're not Colombians, and we don't want to be Colombians, and that's one thing that we want to get rid of. Many people do accept Colombia, but we don't. And at a period of time, what is now Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Panama, and even Peru were one and only one territory. And it was divided by the powers of the wealthiest people who wanted to take control over resources, territories, and peoples for extractivist purposes, and that's why this country exists. So with that clarified, I'm a surgeon. I have trained in general surgery and colorectal surgery, and I still practice it. But for more than almost 50 years now, I've been involved in different social movements, indigenous movements, organizations, and struggles in Colombia and in other parts of this continent. I've had to leave Colombia on 7 occasions into exile because of death threats and being persecuted, as many other people have in this country. And I have always returned to Colombia as well. So, so far I have managed to, although I have trained as a surgeon and practiced surgery, I cannot say I am a surgeon. I am beyond that. I'm somebody who is part of movements, processes, organizations with different peoples in different places. So that's one way of presenting myself that I'd like to give you. And I will start from a very personal anecdote or remembrance. When I was in medical school in the city of Bogota, the capital city, the hospitals that looked after most of the people in Colombia, where we trained as medical students, were what they called charity hospitals. So hospitals of the poor, for the poor, within a system that those hospitals had to look after 65 to 70% of the population, but they had less than 10% of the resources that the healthcare system as a whole had. So it was poor medicine for the poor, but it was a place where physicians were trained and nurses and other health personnel, but actually to try to escape from the public health system, the charity system, into the private system that looked after less than 5% of the population, but had close to 80% of the resources of the country. So we trained looking after the poor in poor conditions, but then most of my colleagues and friends tried to escape from that and practice for the wealthy under the wealthiest conditions. By the month of September, October, every year, the usual was that the charity hospitals would run out of budget completely every year. So from then on, they had to survive in every way. Like somebody came to emergencies with a fractured bone, they had to find the casts, the medication for pain, everything, because the system did not provide anything at all. If you came to the hospital and you had to be admitted to hospital, your family had to bring your food because it wouldn't provide even food within the hospital. So that gives you an idea. But where I wanted to start was training within that system and doing a rotation in surgery. We were asked to do a research project, whatever we wanted. What I decided to do was based on something that was appealing. The public health reports showed that the first causes of morbidity and mortality in Colombia were trauma. In fact, Colombia's first cause of death was homicide until recently. So, and that's what we saw in the emergency departments. We saw people with all kinds of injuries and mostly gunshot injuries. So I'll tell you of the many people I decided to follow from the emergency department. I just went to emergencies, and whoever I saw with trauma, I tried to go to their social context, their families, their stories, and develop a story that led into the trauma and the context of the trauma rather than just the care component within the hospital. But I also included the care component inside the hospital and what happened or didn't happen to them. So I'll tell you briefly what I saw and what led to the rest of what I'd like to tell you here, war and peace, etc. First, one night, there was a woman I saw in the adult emergency department, and she was desperate with stab wounds to her chest and her abdomen. quite stable, but she was desperate because she said her daughter had been injured and she had been stabbed by her husband, who was a member of the Colombian armed forces. That was the first patient I saw. So because she was worried about her daughter, I went to look for her daughter at the pediatric emergency department. And I found a beautiful 11-year-old girl that had been stabbed in the back and had a spinal cord injury in the upper thoracic spine and was paralyzed and remained paralyzed from then on. She just died 2 years ago, and this is more than 40 years ago when it happened. And she was also stabbed by her father. And there was a baby boy that this woman was carrying in her arms that had been killed by this man as well. So I followed this story. In fact, I managed to go to the jail where this man was kept and actually talk to him. I won't go into details, but I'll give you an idea. This woman married this man to escape from a patriarchal environment at home where her father only made her do housework. She had to be obedient, she had to go to church on Sundays, and she had no opportunity to develop herself as a human being, whereas her brothers had all kinds of opportunities to get out in spite of the conditions of poverty. So she wanted to escape that environment, and the way out was marrying somebody. And of course, one of the people that she could approach were the army people that came into town in a context of war. So she escaped her house by marrying this man, for whom she felt nothing, but it was a way out. The man told me in jail that he was extremely jealous of this woman, and he constantly thought she was going to find another man to escape from him the same way she had escaped from her home. The patriarchal macho environment that she escaped from was reproduced where she lived. In the meantime, they had 2 children, this girl and the baby boy. He became more and more and more paranoid, and he was throughout his life involved in the Colombian armed conflict. So he was a poor man forced to fight the armed insurgents in Colombia without any understanding of a context, and recruited into the army because that was a way out of poverty for many people. So you went there to die for the wealthy, to die to protect an order for the rich and privileged. You didn't understand why and what for, but that gave you some power, some privilege, including accessing the women you wanted in the poor environments. Just to give you the context of this situation. And in brief, that was one of the cases which I followed more thoroughly later on, and I went to see this woman's parents in their small rural community where she escaped from by marrying this army guy. That was one case. Just give you briefly 3 of the more than 60 cases that I followed and described. The second case was simply in a rural hospital. A man came with a fractured arm, but he was sitting in the emergency department from about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was 8 o'clock. He hadn't been seen, but he kept letting other people go in to be seen, even though he had arrived earlier than others. So I went, looked for him, looked after him, put a cast on him. He had no money. And then when we put the cast, we used to save some cast rolls in the emergency department from somebody we had looked after, or made them buy an extra one so that we could have casts for people who didn't have any way to buy them. And this was the case with this man. The reason why he didn't want to be looked after following his position in the line, in the queue, was that he was too poor and he had no money, so he felt he didn't deserve to be looked after. This man recycled garbage and fished whatever he could. And he lived alone in a hut next to the river in an absolute condition of poverty. He had almost nothing at all. He basically starved, and he survived through the strength of his body in total misery. That was a second case I wanted to mention. And the country was at the time under a state of siege that the government had declared. Colombia was under a state of siege for close to 30 years, continuously, something you'll understand from where you are. And that state of siege was apparently for our security. During the worst periods of the state of siege, the army just shot at people and killed them, and after they were dead, they were accused of being armed insurgents, terrorists, etc. One Saturday, when I was beginning my call in the hospital at 6 o'clock in the morning, a man had been shot in the back, lower back, with an explosive bullet, and it had blown his entire hip. And he was in shock. He recovered from that, but then, of course, from then on, he was left with major injuries, a colostomy, all kinds of trouble, and so on. This man was going to work. He was just walking home at 18 years of age from home to go to work to survive. And the army commanders that were around shot him because they were rewarded by their commanders for each casualty, war casualty that they could achieve. So he was falsely accused of being a terrorist and shot, and he was one of the many in that regard. So that begins to give you a context of the kinds of things we used to see. On top of that, when people arrived to the emergency departments to be looked after, most of the time there were no beds. The beds at the hospitals were full. We couldn't look after them. So even if they came with major injuries, they had to be sent to other hospitals, and they came, we called it in Spanish, el paseo de la muerte, which is the death travel or the death trip, which meant they went from one hospital to another, to another, to another, and then eventually died without any assistance. And that was common. A girl of 15 years of age had been stabbed in her groin by an 11-year-old boy who lived in the streets, gamines we call them, who are children who escaped their homes or who had no homes and living gangs in the streets of Colombia. And one of these kids wanted to steal a notebook from this girl that went to night school. And because she refused to give him the book and slapped him in the face with the notebook, he stabbed her in the groin. When she came to the emergency department, we had no beds. So I went out. I was the only one to go out. I was a student. I was not a surgeon. I wasn't capable of providing the care she needed. But I assessed her, and the location of the wound was dangerous. It could have injured the femoral vessels in the groin. She was not bleeding. She was stable. I put a dressing on and told them she was in a police car, not an ambulance, because they could not afford an ambulance. So I put a dressing on her wound, asked the nurses to put intravenous fluids, and went to look for a hospital for her through a radio system, and found the hospital, another university hospital that would look after her. And then I went to see some other patients. When I came back, they were resuscitating a patient in one of the emergency rooms. It was this girl. Within an hour, they hadn't transported her to another hospital, they hadn't started an IV, and she actually died at age 15 from this. Rather than a scandal within society to deal with this horrendous situation, a child stabbing another child for a notebook and killing her, the lack of beds to look after her in a hospital, and her having to go, like many others, from one place to the other, and the police not even helping to carry her to the other hospital, but leaving her there. Rather than looking into that, I was accused of second-degree homicide because I hadn't looked after this girl. So that gives you an idea of our context and what happened there. When I presented my research, which included more than 60 of these situations, the whole spectrum from the social to the treatment in surgical terms, the professors of surgery at the university, for the most part, except for one, were bored with my presentations. They wanted a case study of technical components of treatment, diagnosis, etc. They didn't care about the political stuff. That was not what medicine was about, and that was not what we were supposed to be doing. So that piece of research, in fact, I actually presented to the health workers and patients in the hospital, and they liked it, and it triggered the discussion. But our colleagues and my professors were not interested in this. So that's just to give you an idea of what I think is common in different places. Then, of course, we used to read and try to find with different students and professors that inspired us to try to go beyond what they were forcing us to learn, to turn our backs against what was going on in our country, and to use training in healthcare professions to become wealthy and look after ourselves and not be part of a society that was obviously falling apart. But one of the conclusions of my research, clear conclusions of my research, is that if we didn't pay attention to the social dynamics that were leading to violence and that were also leading to the morbidity and mortality from that, we would certainly, within a decade or less, would certainly be involved in a global, in a national at least, catastrophe, where the healthcare system would even go into worse crises, because the most expensive aspect of healthcare is trauma. ICU, multiple surgeries, the medications, all that's needed. The more war grows, the less the system is capable to look after this. And in fact, no resources will be enough to pay for the healthcare system. We were looking into these things and trying to do something, and there were a few of us mobilizing and trying to do stuff, when two very good friends of ours, you may have heard about them because this was known, from Ecuador, Jaime Breil and Edmundo Granda, wrote a tiny book that reached us through photocopies, and it was called Social Epidemiology. And the essence of that work was that rather than the classic North American epidemiologic approach, that society produces health or disease, that actually what we see arriving at our hospitals is a product of social conditions. And to us, that being said with that clarity, with actually scientific relevance, with social relevance and commitment, was extraordinary. And so Edmundo and Jaime Breil opened the light for us, saying this is not a marginalized position, this shouldn't be something on the corner, this is the most important aspect we have to learn. Colombia generates war, violence. Poverty is a form of violence against the poor. It's not a natural situation. So all these things were visible to us. Why? Because the emergency departments and the healthcare systems were receptacles, recipients of the social conditions that had to be changed. And that was absolutely obvious. But the healthcare personnel was being trained to ignore these conditions and to not approach them. So this is where we trained, and the system ended up punishing social commitment. Any physician who did not pursue the track to become a super specialist and to enter the reduced market of profit making would be and was and still is punished by the system, because you end up doing poor medicine or poor nursing or poor healthcare for the poor, not real medicine, not real healthcare. So the best people around us ended up in the most impoverished areas of the country without resources, without access to updating or upgrading their learning, and also, worst of all, incapable of changing the social conditions because they were punished and isolated. So they were drowned within the conditions that produced the war, the trauma, and what we see happening. So this is the context, and I'll give you now the context, the overall context of our country, of Colombia. Colombia was labeled by Javier Giraldo, a priest who's been involved in human rights activities for more than 50 years, a very respected man. He wrote a book called A Genocidal Democracy, and that is Colombia. Colombia has not had a dictatorship formally throughout the history of Latin America, where most of the countries of Latin America have had military dictatorships. It hasn't had one because it hasn't needed one. There are elections every 2 and every 4 years continuously, but there are elections in a way such that the most powerful are elected and reach the positions of power and nothing changes. And in fact, the way in which this happens is because you have a mechanism of repression, of social control through war, through violation of human rights, through social injustice, that allows this electoral process to be maintained as a mask, as an image of democracy. And that is a model that has been the largest recipient of US aid in the entire history of this continent. Colombia has been the US's closest ally in the Latin American continent in history. This is precisely the purpose. And they have been advisors in the healthcare system, in the educational system, in the justice system, but most of all, in that system of war and repression that remains up to our days, leading to what Colombia has had, a long-standing history of popular resistance everywhere, all the time, since the minute the Spanish started the invasion of what we now call Colombia. When the African enslaved people were brought from Africa, there were immediately insurgencies that were successful up to our days. One of the most famous ones was Bencos Bioho from the Bisagos Islands in Guinea-Bissau. Bencos Bioho had been trained as a Canadi in his own community in Africa. A Canadi around the age of 25, 30 still exists in the Bisagos Islands. A man at that age has to go to the jungle and survive and provide for his family on his own, under all kinds of dangers and circumstances in difficult contexts. Bencos arrived in Cartagena to be sold as a slave and to be punished. As a Canadi, he tried to escape once and again till he managed to organize a group of people that escaped and created a palenque. A palenque is a free territory, and the first free territory in the entire continent of the Americas was the Palenque de San Basilio, next to Cartagena, and he organized it. Just to give you an idea of how they did it, up to our days, you've seen Afro women wearing hairdresses with lines in their head, braids in their heads. Well, what Bencos and their people organized were maps of the territories and escape routes. in the hairdress of the women in Cartagena, and they followed those maps from the head of the women to escape into palenques. The palenques spread throughout Colombia. Bencos was eventually, and here's important because I'll start making bridges to the peace processes. Bencos was not defeated, and the Spanish became very scared, being a minority in this territory, that it would spread and that they would be expelled, which would probably have happened. So they proposed a peace negotiation with Bencos and the people of the Palenque. Under that context, Bencos agreed to the peace negotiation, and then the peace process went on, and Bencos was allowed to go in and out of Cartagena unarmed, and he could dress as a Spaniard. He was eventually captured, betrayed, murdered, and the Palenques were all remained in extreme poverty, and they survive until today as a memory of a fight, a struggle for freedom, but limited under the conditions of the peace agreement that has always been betrayed on the side of those in power. They negotiate a ceasefire. You cease, I fire. That was one component. In the territory where I am, indigenous peoples, the Nasa people, there was a Spaniard who came to this territory, a conqueror, and forced people to gather around him. And when they gathered around him, there was one indigenous leader who didn't come to the gathering because he was the leader of his community, not the Spaniard. So he was brought in, and he was killed in fire in front of the rest of the community. His mother, La Gaitana, organized an army that defeated the Spanish, and they would have defeated and sent the Spaniards out of these territories had it not been for a treason within the indigenous communities of people who wanted privilege within the Spanish society, and within a peace negotiation, they left him out. So just to give you an idea. So what I wanted to say with this is that all along, way before the wars of independence, there have been struggles to fight against oppression from the people on the basis. But the independence we obtained in all of the countries in Latin America, the so-called independence, were the wealthy sons, men of the Spaniards who wanted to have the privilege the Spaniards had before them. So they used the poor and they used freedom to actually organize armies that fought for them and their privilege. Our countries, all of the Latin American countries, all of them, have been countries of the criollos, Creole. The criollos were the wealthy sons of Spaniards that became landowners, wealthy and enslaved indigenous, Afro, and other peoples, creating a class society that was even worse in many aspects than the society established by the Spaniards. This is a long story, but I want to reach the point of the peace negotiations from this. So what did we have? Colombia is the most unequal country in Latin America, the most unequal. There is more concentration of wealth and land in Colombia than in any other country in Latin America, and often the most unequal country in the entire world. There are very few very wealthy families, and most of the people are impoverished. The main struggle in Colombia is a struggle for land. What people fight for is social justice in land distribution, because people have managed to survive in spite of all this because of land and the fertile lands that they make productive. So what the wealthy have done all along in Colombia is, Colombia was a very short stretch of land, and then people escaped from the wealthy, opened up territories, develop free communities, and then the wealthy would come in, take over those territories, and that's how this country was established. It's the same with Ecuador, and it's the same with other countries. I hope that gives you an image of war and conquest never ended when the Spanish arrived or were sent out. It continues to our days, a constant war of conquest. Now, and whoever wins in war takes over, and that's the Colombian state. So the essence of the conflict in Colombia that became an armed conflict is, in fact, that the wealthy, supported by transnational corporations and the US, in an extremely wealthy country in all kinds of resources, the wealthy concentrate wealth and the majority starve and are in poverty. And that social conflict is not and has not been allowed to be resolved through social services, provision of health care, provision of education. That has been denied in spite of tremendous struggles from people to achieve that, which forced us into armed insurgencies. The origin of the armed insurgencies in Colombia is a conflict that has been largely ignored and forced people to defend themselves, ourselves, and organized into armed insurgencies. The paradox of this is that the US and the US-backed elites wanted to push people into war to have a pretext to militarize the country. And that's why Colombia becomes the largest recipient of US military aid. And I don't know if you've heard it, but Colombia is labeled the Israel of Latin America because it has received for years the support, the training, the weapons of the Israeli army and the Mossad, etc. In fact, paramilitary forces allied with drug trafficking and the elites were formed by Yair Klein, a lieutenant of the Israeli army that was contracted and brought here to form the paramilitary armies, and many, many more of this story. So here you are, you armed insurgencies, the two largest ones, FARC and ELN, are born in the early 60s as armed insurgencies to deal with the social conflict of social injustice. And then to maintain social order and democracy, the army in Colombia and the terror from the state grows, and anyone involved in a struggle for social justice, from health, from anywhere, is immediately labeled a terrorist and part of these terrorist organizations. That happened to all of us, and that explains why I was in exile for 7 times from my country, because no matter what I was involved with, if you try to change social conditions in Colombia, the response from the state is repression and oppression. So 5 decades of continuous war in Colombia led to a degradation of the social conflict. There was a mentality in the 60s in the Americas that the only way out was the armed struggle, which led to a degradation in that the orthodoxy, the Stalinist approach within these armed factions was that women, indigenous peoples, organized people had to obey the commander of an armed force. And only after the war is won, we'll talk about the end of patriarchies, the rights of indigenous, etc. First, we have to take power. So it was a struggle from armed insurgencies that were hierarchical, and their purpose was to take over power, and they were actually state formations within the rebel armies. So territories that were controlled by armed insurgencies, particularly FARC, were territories that felt exactly like the ones controlled by the Colombian government, because the commander was the boss. And if the commander decided you're too much of a rebel or you question too much, then you can be killed. In other areas, the commander was a guy that would listen to people and allow opinions to happen. Then it was a different context. So that gives you an idea. What I want to tell you in this stuff is that war degraded the armed struggle into another fact of terror against people. That last phrase I just said, war in Colombia has become another fact of terror against people, was from Noam Chomsky, who came to this region in Colombia where I am, and he actually coming out of a small territory where indigenous peoples were organized into their own organizations, being killed both by the government and by FARC. He made that statement because we had to then face two armies and not just one, two states and not just one. And what happened was people were silenced by war, no matter what. And the way people used to put it here was, if the bullets come from the left or they come from the right, they're still bullets and kill the people. And they don't change our condition. So something that was an insurgency to change social conditions became actually a mechanism to reinforce the conditions. This is the context of the peace process. There were many peace processes before. But now, how did the peace process develop? It is 9 years now since the peace agreement was signed in November of 2016. But it lasted 5 years. The negotiations lasted 5 years. And there was no truce, no ceasefire during the peace negotiations. War went on, and there were large periods of time, months, between one negotiating process in Havana and the next one in Havana. So between the two sets of negotiations, there was war going on. What happened there was a strategy or a tactic used by the US with the Colombian government, which was war was an argument at the peace negotiation. If I'm intimidating you, if I'm defeating you militarily, if I cause casualties to you and I take over territory, then you come at a disadvantage to the next negotiation table. And then you concede and concede and concede more, which is actually what happened. What happened was that FARC was losing grounds, and as the time went by and it was losing ground, it conceded more and more. But this will be very clear to you because I think it will make more sense than anything that I've said before. The peace process was announced in Norway, and it was supported by the Norwegian government. When it was announced, the president of Colombia said this: the model will not be negotiated. The model will not be negotiated. This is the essence, I think, of understanding the failure or success of any peace negotiation. What led to war in Colombia? What led to armed conflict? The model, a colonial model, a patriarchal model, the concentration of land, the exclusion of most people. If we can't negotiate that, then what can we negotiate? The outcome will be we will have peace within the same social structure. In other words, we'll have the peace of the owners without people. Behind every single one of the peace negotiations in recent years in this continent, that is the premise. The State Department and the CIA and the US government are behind these peace processes. In Guatemala, 20 years before the Colombian peace agreement was signed, in El Salvador, in Colombia, and we said it in an article that we wrote together with my partner, Vilma Almendra. And we said, between the peace of the owners without the peoples and towards the peace of the peoples without the owners. And it was clear that we were going to the peace of the owners, and that's no peace. Because, and let me state it clearly, we did not have a peace process and there was no peace agreement signed in Colombia. There was a ceasefire negotiation between two armed factions. excluding the people. And what was achieved as a peace agreement, even if it approached issues such as land reform, was not going to succeed because the model was not to be touched. In fact, 9 years after that agreement was signed, that one FARC that was with a commander over in all of its armed groups, more than 50,000 throughout the country, became multiple what they call dissident groups without any commanders. Each one of those groups acts in territories, and they actually fight each other to control territories, and many of them, if not most of them, are now involved in drug trafficking or related interests like that. So from one armed conflict, now we are involved in a total armed conflict and in a context of total war, but the political essence of this context to transform a reality has been lost. And most of these armed factions are not fighting to transform a reality and a political exclusion reality, but to fit into it. I want to give you an image of what Colombia, and not only Colombia, is now. We call it autonomous criminal territories. What is happening is, if you look at maps of the country, and these are done by NGOs that are very credible and they're looking into the trends of the armed conflict, you'll see the entire rural areas of the country in 3 colors. One color indicates that a group has, an armed faction has total control of that territory. And total control is total control. That's the state in there. They control, you have to pay them tributes. They control the production. They provide services, water, education, healthcare. They provide, the state, national state doesn't. And mostly what they do this for is banana plantations, agribusiness, mining, species, trade of people, and drugs, as well as many other things, are huge economic, legal and illegal processes. And these armed factions sell this to elites, mafias, coordinated around the government and beyond, so that they flow up to the north. I'll give you numbers. 1 kilogram of cocaine produced in Colombia is about $1,800 here, US dollars. It will be $20,000 in the US. It will be close to $40,000 in Europe. But if you look at the data in Turkey, it can be anywhere between $75,000 and $90,000. This is a United Nations report. Now you have a public health problem from a social condition, which is the growth of addiction to these kinds of drugs and fentanyl more and more today. But the social problem, the social conflict, just as the social conflict led to the war here, is not approached as a public health concern to address the determinants of this problem in the north that are leading to addictions and more than 100,000 deaths a year in the US, mostly from fentanyl combined with cocaine. Rather than addressing that problem, which is allowing a flow of wealth into the north massively, what they do is give military treatment to this problem, war treatment to this problem, which actually maintains and rises the price, global prices of this illegal market, which provides more profit to them and creates these huge transnational markets, mafias, money that flows into financial institutions, legal financial institutions involved in this, and all this is established. The more war on drugs you have, the less you attack the central problem. You don't touch the drug traffickers and the mafias, but you attack the people that produce the leaves, transform like slaves the cocaine to cocaine, and kill the people in boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific as though they're murdering and poisoning your people and they are narco-terrorists, which is what's going on right now, but you don't touch the problem, so you maintain the markets. On the other hand, so you have two sides of an equation. One side is promoting drug trafficking because it generates wealth, and the other side is a war on that in order to maintain it and actually to fund the occupation of territories, colonial occupation of territories, so that you can access, for example, what is happening now. The Trump administration wants the oil in Venezuela, which is the reason why it is killing people in the coast. 3 more yesterday, 64 people assassinated in the Caribbean in boats because they were accused, sentenced, and murdered by the largest army ever present in the Caribbean in the history of this continent. Right now, the Gerald Ford, the largest destroyer in the US Army with nuclear capacity, is outside the coasts of Venezuela. And the president of Colombia, the first time that we have a president from the left in the country who has fought against drug trafficking for 30 years, has been accused by Trump as being a drug trafficker. And the country is not receiving any kind of military or economic aid from the US because of this. So it's being choked, and that's the reason. So what's the outcome of the peace agreements signed in November? The outcome of the peace agreement signed in November can be summarized as this. The social conflict was not touched. Not touched. Therefore, it's deepening. The one-armed insurgency throughout the country has been dismantled and transformed into multiple armed insurgencies that control different territories throughout the country more than before. These terrorist armed groups that are linked to global capital now and not to revolutionary forces, these are in coordination with transnational corporate interests who buy whatever they produce, mining, legal or illegal, and they're also linked to government resources, to electoral processes, etc. The people in Guatemala warned us. They told us 20 years before the peace agreement was signed, be careful. We are worse off after the peace agreement. Am I saying that we were better off before the peace agreement was signed? No. What I want to tell you clearly was said by Sub-Commander Moises of the Zapatista process in southern Mexico. We have to free ourselves of the capitalist system. We have to free ourselves of the imperial system, of the patriarchal system. Something that we've learned from Öcalan's paradigm. The 3 points of the Öcalan's paradigm that here are discussed. 1, this is the revolution of the women, from the women, against patriarchy. 2, democratic confederalism. Decision-making processes from the base in communities beyond the state. The state will always serve them, not us. And 3, what you call, or what has been called there, an ecological struggle, which we call here the liberation of Mother Earth. We have to free ourselves within territories, with the territory. So what has happened with the peace agreement is that, for the most part, the people that need to develop agendas in territories to transform a social reality have been marginalized from this and have been subdued to a global extractive process. Why? Because at the negotiating table, you had commanders from one side or the other under US control. And you had an institutional process based on the state legislation, legislative Congress. And the Congress will define what is possible. And then what should be is replaced by what can be according to existing legislation. We will never achieve peace if we cannot achieve what should be. I'm not saying by saying this that a peace process can change or transform a reality. But what a peace process should be, and I'll say it this way, if commanders decide for people and the decision they make is wrong, who will pay the price? The people. So the decisions have to be made collectively with the people, from the people. If the people make a mistake, it's their mistake. They learn from it and they change. But you cannot represent the people and supplant the people in a peace process. If you do that, we'll end up in a worse condition than we were before. And this is what we're seeing here. Now, a little digression on the health issue under this discussion. Just for the conversation, I'm aware that I'm leaving a lot outside, hopefully for our conversation to invite questions and discussions, disagreements, whatever it is. But I want to put this. So we have learned the essence of the system we're under since conquest has been hegemony, and the hegemony of the conqueror for profit. That hegemony remains to our days and is not discussed in a peace negotiation. It's left out, either for practical reasons or because of the power imbalance, or because you adapt to what you can do and then you leave out the essential perspectives. The strategic components are left behind. I learned from the Kurdish struggle that the relationship with the state is only tactical, always tactical, and never strategic. You don't negotiate your strategic goals, your objectives with them. You take what you can, but you know where you're going. What we lost in the peace negotiations was precisely that. The means, ceasefire, achieving some legislative changes, the liberation of certain prisoners, those were means to an end. But the end has gone. What we thought we had achieved peace by achieving the means. They freed some people. There's no more war between these factions. The armed forces were dismantled and the guerrillas were given jobs. Therefore, we have peace. That's not peace. We can't lose sight of what we want to be as a nation, and we have to develop it with people. So where did our real lessons come from? And this is where we are now. 2019, 2020, 2021, up to our dates. You may have heard of this. Massive popular uprisings. Massive. Because the peace process did not open space for people to develop peace, for people to develop agendas, because they were being negotiated up there by the few for the people, rather than we negotiate our ceasefire, but people develop their own agendas and they'll decide on social transformation. That's what needed to happen. So in 2019, Chile was first. Massive uprising. Who started the uprising? The 13, 14, and 15 school students in Santiago. The pretext was the price of the subway was increased. The kids refused to pay it, and from there they were fed up with the establishment, and the entire nation, millions in every city in Chile, came out to the streets. It wasn't a commander. It wasn't an armed group. It wasn't a union. It was the people as a whole in an uprising. Somebody betrayed this uprising 2 years into it, and it was current President BORIČ. He represented or pretended to represent the mobilizations and negotiated peace with the government through a constitutional process, a constituent assembly. So he was labeled a traitor by the people of Chile in the streets, not by me. So a year later, he was the presidential candidate, and either he won or Katz, a Nazi, open Nazi, would win. So everybody had to vote for Boric. Boric ended up militarizing the Mapuche territory. Boric ended up delivering the country to transnational corporate interests, and he maintains a progressive discourse of transformation, but in practice, nothing has changed. So that happened with that uprising. Ecuador, massive uprising. Just last week, the largest uprising in terms of time in the history of Ecuador took place until now. People are fed up with the state. Until that state disappears or is transformed, the uprisings will continue. Until the agendas come from the people and are developed by the people, we'll have no peace. So this is ongoing in Ecuador. So the rule in Ecuador is now under one of the wealthiest people, a drug dealer, and a repressive man who campaigned on behalf of Trump. Colombia, I'll tell you this so it'll give you an idea from where I started. Colombia has 1,100 municipalities, close to 50 million people. The first day of the April 2021 uprising, 895 municipalities were out in the streets, out of 1,100. 895, nobody ruled this uprising. It was all of us fed up of this, and we began assemblies to transform a reality from below. The three lines of the democratic confederalism paradigm were out in the streets. What happened? This was used for electoral process and led to the election of Petro. Good in that he's a man from the left. Bad in that it weakened the construction of social transformation from below. My final question, and I'll leave it as a question, is this. What is help in a context of threatening genocide, of social injustice, of class exclusion, of a growing mafia global system? What is it? Can we continue to focus on the access of care in the tertiary system as an emphasis and ignore the rest? Or can we only focus on social transformation and then ignore people's right to access to services and resources? And I think the answer is out there. Both. You cannot tell a victim of a constant state of war and exclusion that you will look after him or her once the social conditions change. They have a right to be looked after well and now, like the 15-year-old girl stabbed by the little boy in the streets. She should have been looked after in that hospital, and we have to fight for access of appropriate quality health care. It's a false dilemma to say either care or social transformation for care. But if we focus on care and we ignore the transformation from below, then there won't be, even the healthcare system will not work no matter how much pressure we put. So our role is both simultaneously to demand from within access to quality healthcare, reforms and transformations of the system, simultaneously or as part of the transformation of a society. That transformation of the society from the people is peace. The question is, do peace processes contribute to the construction of a society where people can do what societies do, which is, all societies do in principle, which is care, cure for one another in many different ways within territories. This is just a provocation, but I'll leave it there for our conversation. I hope this gave an idea.
Çok teşekkür ederiz Manuel. E, Uzun bir değerlendirme oldu. Hem bir Kolombiya biz demiyoruz dediniz ama ne dediğinizi bize söylemediniz. Muhtemel Latin Amerika diyorsunuz. Kolombiya yerine neyi kullanıyorsunuz? İlk başta öyle başlamışsınız çünkü. Var mı cevabı Osman?
Yes, thank you. The entire what we call now Latin American continent from Mexico south, more and more is called Abya Yala. Abya Yala is from the language of ancestral people in what they call Panama today, the Kuna Yala. The Kunas, Guna Dule are the indigenous peoples of that area that they call Panama. In fact, they're not involved within the state of Panama. They have their own Congress and their own autonomy. And it was in 1901 that they liberated themselves from the Panamanian government. If you want to go to the islands of Cunayala, you have to obtain a visa, and they will decide if you can go in or not. So it's Abya Yala. And North America is called by the indigenous peoples in North America the Turtle Island. Turtle Island because in their conceptions between different nations in the north, this was a turtle that had gradually moved away from the rest of the other continents. And if you probably know that Brazil was right at the edge of, geologically, was at the edge of Africa, and it was the same continent. So to them, it is Turtle Island, and that's more and more the alternative. There are many conceptions, many names, but the essence is that more and more people are accepting the fact that there will not be a state solution to this. The territories and peoples follow something else, and that we have hugely in common with the Kurdish struggle and Kurdish people. We understand the Kurdish struggle, and they understand us here in the most remote and smallest of the communities when we talk about the analysis of the nation state.
Çok teşekkürler. Doğrudan ben dinleyici arkadaşlara söz vereyim. Ara bir değerlendirme yapmadan sizden daha çok yararlanmak isteriz. Son söyledikleriniz oldukça güncel bizim Türkiye'de, Kürdistan'da yürüttüğümüz tartışmalara zenginlik katıyor. Özellikle e, e, sağlıkla toplumsal dönüşümün eş zamanlı düşünülmesi gerektiği ya da e, mevcut ne diyelim yıkıma karşı sağlık hizmetini vermekten de vazgeçmeme, bunu devam ettirme en azından bir sağlık heyeti olarak bizim için kıymetli. Fatma Güneş arkadaşımızın bir sorusu var.
Evet, başlayayım mı? Benim
Tabii tabii.
birkaç tane soru not aldım ama sırayla dönelim diye
Bence
düşünüyorum.
hepsini söyleyelim peş peşe. E,
Tamam. İlk örnek verdiğinde bir kadın kızı ve oğlundan bahsetmişti Monel hocamız. Bu ataerkil zihniyetin hani bu kadar böyle kilometrelerce uzak ülkelerin bile aynı toplumsal zihniyette bir araya gelmesini nasıl açıklayabiliriz aslında? İlk sorum bu. İkincisi de yoksul tıptan bahsederken cezalandırılan diğer profesör doktor arkadaşlarından bahsetmişti. Kendisinin bu sisteme karşı gelmek için bireysel olarak bir mücadelesi olmuş 7 defa çünkü hani sürgün yediğini söyledi. Detayları da açıkçası merak ediyorum. Yani 7 biraz yüksek bir rakam çünkü hani insanın bir yerde bir pes edip sisteme artık hani insanoğluyuz ve bir yerde pes etme noktasına gelebiliyoruz. O eşiği nasıl aştığını merak ediyorum. Hani kendi sosyal hayatındaki sorunları göz ardı edip bu şekilde ayakta kaldığını açıkçası merak ettim. Bir de bu farkın toprak reformunu ben toplantıdan önce biraz araştırdım. Toprak reformundan sonra toprağa böyle 15 yıl boyunca hükümet biraz daha böyle zamanla yayarak aslında kırsala dağıtmış ve ilk dağıtımından bu yıla kadar uyuşturucu kaçakçılığı 2 kat kadar artmış. Hani sayılar öyle gösteriyor. 25 bin insan kadar da kayıp olduğu söyleniyor hani yapılan haberlerde. Evet hani insanlar bir şeyler için örgütlenmişler. Güzel bir mücadele, 52 yıllık bir mücadeleden ve barışla sonuçlandığını söylüyoruz. Ama barış sürecindeki asıl sorunların hala çözüm bulmaması, o toplumsal dönüşümün yaşanmaması tam olarak bir barış gerçekleştiği anlamına gelir mi gelmez mi? Şimdilik bu kadar. Teşekkür ederim.
Ee, Tüm soruları ortak mı alalım yoksa böyle soru cevap diye mi gidelim? Manuel karar versin. Ortak alalım galiba.
I think we'll collect
Tamam.
them.
O zaman
I've
Dicle'nin
talked too
sorusu
much.
varmış galiba. Dicle'den bir soru alalım.
Merhabalar herkese. Sesim geliyor mu hocam?
Geliyor, geliyor.
Ha, tamam. Emeğinize sağlık. Teşekkür ederiz. Yani süreçlerin biraz benzediğini de düşündüm açıkçası. Bir yerde hocamız şunu söyledi aslında. Halkın kendi kararı değil, üzerindeki birkaç kişinin beraber toplandığı, konuştuğu ve devam ettiği bir süreç olarak da bir barış süreci tarifi yaptı. Yani bu kısım böyle bir tür yani ve bunun aslında hani çözümünün de pek buradan çıkamayacağını da belirten bir tarzda konuştu gibi anladım. Hani buradan baktığında Türkiye'deki süreci de böyle mi okuyor? Hani böyle okuyabilir miyiz ya da hani nasıl bakıyor diye bir sormak istemiştim. Yani bana biraz benzer geldi. Yine üzerindeki birkaç kişinin konuştuğu ve aslında halkın kabulünün de çok da gelişmediği, yani iki taraflı halktan da bahsediyorum. Sadece Kürt halkının olarak gibi bir yerden değil. Yani iki tarafın da aslında çok teşne olmadığı bir şey olarak yorumladığım için biraz oradaki sürecin aynısı gibi geldi bana. Acaba hoca ne düşünür bu konuda?
Teşekkürler.
Teşekkür ederim.
Evet arkadaşlar, başka soru varsa. Ben de bu şeyi açmanızı
Ben-
biraz isteyeceğim. Bu taktik meselesi, yani Kürt hareketinin barış sürecindeki yaptıklarının stratejik değil taktik olduğunu söylediniz. Bu bence oldukça ne diyeyim, yaratıcı bir tespite benziyor. Yani bizi etkileyen bir tespit oldu ve en azından ben etkilendim. Yani süreçteki güncel konuşulanların ana stratejiyi değiştirmediği. Ana strateji derken de konuşmanızdan işte bu ekolojik, kadın özgürlükçü, öz yönetimci bir toplumsal dönüşüm hedefi, yeni bir devrimsel hedef gibi Stalinist ulus devleti ele geçirme yönlü bir toplumsal dönüşüm değil, tabandan gelen öz yönetimci yeni bir komünal toplum arayışı diye anladım stratejik yönelimi. Doğru mu anlamışım diye sormuş olayım. Ayşe Hocam.
Çok teşekkür ederiz. Hem size hem de Manuel arkadaşa çok teşekkürler. Benim bir sorum olacak. Şimdi e, barış sürecini, Kolombiya'daki barış sürecini komutanlarla işte devlet arasında görüşmeler olarak tarif etti. Halbuki biz buradan takip ederken Kolombiya'da çeşitli geniş komisyonlar kurulduğunu barış masasında, işte kadınların temsil edildiğini barış masasında, ondan sonra tartışmalar olduğunu, sonra anayasa oylaması falan yapıldığını, böyle şeyler hatırlıyorum ben yanlış hatırlamıyorsam. Yani o hani komisyonların sadece komutanların değil de sivil toplumun da dahil olduğu komisyonların tartıştığı bir masa gibi hatırlıyorum. Fakat tabii bu anayasa oylaması filan böyle şeyler oldu. Ben o da yani ben şimdi siz komutanlar konuştu, halk katılmadı diyene kadar ben şöyle değerlendiriyordum kendi kafamda. Yani evet Kolombiya'da şey oldu işte gerillalar sivil hayata döndü, pek çok şey oldu ve pek çoğu da katledildi o e, norm dışı devletin güçleri tarafından, yani oradaki bir takım derin devlet çeteleri tarafından katledildi pek çok komutan da. Yani o mücadelenin öncüleri. Şimdi ben şunu şöyle düşünmüştüm, yani hani evet, anayasada yapıldı, bir sürü şey de yapıldı, ama bu yapılan şeylerin toplumsallaşamaması diye bir sorun olduğunu, yani hani bu bir ateşkes süreciydi. Evet, bir savaş, bir çatışma vardı. Bu çatışmanın bitmesi gerekiyordu. Bitti. Fakat barışın kurulması için gerekli inşa sürecinin e, üzerinde, yani o gerçekleştirilemedi. Hani sanki ateşkes olunca ve de o ateşkes ve bir takım kurallar konunca her şey bitmiş gibi elbette düşünmemek lazım. Burada bir takım sorunlar olduğunu düşünmüştüm. Yani siz farklı bir şey mi söylüyorsunuz? Yani komutanlarla, elbette savaşanlarla konuşulacak. Onlar da yani onlarla da konuşulacak. Yoksa savaş nasıl bitecek? Ben burada kafamda bir soru var, onu sormak istedim.
Teşekkürler Ayşe arkadaş. Muhammed, sonra da Serhat.
Merhaba arkadaşlar. Öncelikle hocamızın ellerine sağlık. Düzenleyen arkadaşların da ellerine sağlık. Şey soracağım yani belki Latin Amerika'dan bizim çok benzer özelliğimiz var ama büyük bir fark var gibi. Bizde ulus devlet, ulus kimliği aslında hani toplumsal olarak çok katı bir formda seyrediyor. Hatta toplumsal olarak faşizm yaygın bir dil olarak kullanılıyor aslında. Toplumsal dil üretiminde, dil
Evet.
kullanımında birçok alanda bu dile çok muhatap oluyoruz. Latin Amerika'da aslında hocamızın da bahsettiği birçok grup e, hiçbir biriyle öteki olarak yaklaşmadan toplumsal olarak aslında bir uyum içinde yaşayabiliyorlar. Hani şu meşhur bir Marx'ın mektubuyla alakalı şey vardı. İşte İrlandalı işçilerle İngiliz işçiler yan yana gelmiyor. Önce bu sorunu çözmek lazım gibi bir şeyi vardı diye hatırlıyorum bir mektubunda. Burada da hakikaten bu coğrafya için söylüyorum. Yani Kürdistan ve Anadolu coğrafyası için söylüyorum. Ciddi anlamda bir şey var. Katılaşmış bir kimlik var. Irkçılığa varan birçok alanda. Ee, Bunun da bir çözümü nasıl olabilir acaba ya da nasıl bir çözüm üretebilir o toplumsallaşma anlamında? İşte hani devlet elitleri muhtemelen sadece Latin Amerika'da bir otoriter rejimi sürdüren bir grup olarak varlığını sürdürüyor ama Türkiye'de bir de topluma yansıma var gibi görüyorum ben. Bu kadar.
Serhat arkadaş.
Merhabalar herkese. Benim sorum şu, yani ilk başladığı zaman sunumuna ilk sağlık hizmetlerini bir yardımlaşma usulü yürüttüklerini belirtmişti. Bu süreçten sonra bir ideolojik perspektif değişikliğinden sonra halkın sağlık emekçilerine hem sağlık politikalarına hem sağlık hizmet sunumuna katılımı ne düzeyde oldu? Buna dair öz örgütlenmeler, akademik çalışmalar yürütüldü mü? Özellikle de barış sürecinden sonra ya da işte silahlı mücadele noktalanmasından sonra ne gibi imkanlar açığa çıktı? Pozitif mi etkilendi bu süreçten? Varsa böyle bir örgütlenme, negatif mi etkilendi diye sormak isterim.
Fikret ve Soner.
Ben de şeyi tartışmak istiyorum. Olmaz. Şimdi özellikle hocam savaşın kirletme kapasitesini ifade ediyordu. Gerçekten de Kürt hareketi tam da bunu çok tartıştı kendi içinde. Özellikle Kürt halk önderi Abdullah Öcalan'ın. Yani savaş bizi kirletmemesi konusunda her türlü çabayı gösterdik. Çünkü bu savaşma durumu aynı zamanda devletin sürdüğü bu savaş hali bizi de kirletebilir. Biraz ben şey gibi düşünüyorum. Yani bu barış sürecinin kendisini, özellikle bu bizdeki barış sürecinin kendisi bu kadar hızlı adımlar atması biraz bu sürecin, yani sizin de ifade ettiğiniz bu çeteleşme tartışması, başka düzlemlerin oluşmasını acaba engelleyebilir mi? Biraz bende bu soru işaretlerini oluşturdu. Sağlık açısından da tam da bu dediğimiz şey, yani gerçekten savaşın yarattığı travmalar, savaşın yarattığı kirlilik durumu ve katılaşma hali esas bizim soruna yaklaşımımızı da zorlaştırıyor. Benzer katılaşmaları acaba Kolombiya süreçlerinde yaşandı mı? Bu karşı karşıya gelme hali, yani birbirini anlamada zorlaşma. Bu katılık durumu, yani savaşın hem kirletme ve hem de katılaştırma çabası barış sürecini nasıl etkiledi?
Soner arkadaş, teşekkür ederiz Fikret.
Merhabalar. Ee, Herkesin emeğine sağlık. Benim sorum şu, aşağı yukarı aslında arkadaşlarla belki de aynı eksendedir ama şimdi Latin Amerika'daki özgürlük mücadelelerine bakıldığında silahlı mücadelelerin bitirilmesi barışla birlikte demokratik siyasete geçtikten sonra nasıl kazanımlar elde etti bu süreç içerisinde? Yani silahlı mücadeleye nazaran nasıl bir ivme kazandı karşılaştıracak olursak bunun artı ve eksilerine inşa süreci boyutunda neler yazabiliriz? Yani bunun örneklerini bilmek belki de faydalı olacaktır diye düşünüyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
İlk tur için bir soru da ben sorayım. Son soru olsun. Sonra tekrar gerekirse açarız. Şimdi Latin Amerika'da anlatınızdan çok güçlü bir internasyonalizm de var yani. Yani tüm Latin Amerika toplumunu çok rahatlıkla ortak vatan üzerinden anlatan bir dile sahipsiniz. Ama Orta Doğu'da biz böyle bir dile sahip değiliz. İşte Türkiye ve Kürdistan bile kendi içerisinde çok büyük bir gerilim hattı var. Yani sadece bir kapitalist sistemin sömürü ilişkisinin ötesine bir sömürge tartışması Türkiye'de Kürdistan için geçerli. Orta Doğu'nun birçok halkı içinde kendi birbiri arasında ciddi savaşım noktalarının olduğunu söyleyebiliriz. Yani bir şekilde Orta Doğu'da halkların şu anda SDG'nin halkların çoklu bir arada gelmesi gibi bir yöntem ilk kez deneniyor. Halklar daha çok savaş yaparak bir iktidar alanı kurarak kendini var etmiş bir Orta Doğu halklarından konuşurken bugün halkların ortak bir kendi kendine ortak bir şekilde daha demokratik, daha öz yönetimci bir tarzda yeni bir model öneri olarak söyleniyor. İki coğrafyayı bu açıdan da karşılaştırırsanız sevinirim. Söz siz hocam.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the comments, the questions. It's good when one gets questions that we know for a fact we cannot answer many of them, because it's good. That's the complexity of what we're facing. And I realize from hearing your voices and what you're saying, something that is very useful to me, that these are not simple issues. There is no black and white. And one of the main problems we have in Latin America and from Latin America is that when people like us, they tend to perceive us as being better than we really are. We have huge problems, huge and major contradictions, and so it is important to start from there. That I thank you for making those questions, and I hope that you understand that I don't want to give answers, but contribute to a discussion that should be ongoing, where we don't have solutions. I want to be very clear about that. And when we have many problems here. Fatma said, so it's a clarification on some things that I may not have stated clearly. The patriarchal character of our society and of the healthcare system and everything else here is horrendous. And in fact, that gives me an opportunity, Fatma, to say that we were I was part directly, I was involved in probably in recent years, the strongest popular mobilizations in this country, and we were involved in developing a collective agenda. And I'll use this opportunity to share something. There might be similar ways of doing things here, but whenever the Kurdish people come here, they like this. This is one of the things they like, and they want to share. Minga. Minga is a practice of the ancestral Andes, in the mountains of the Andes. What they called Inca people, which were not Inca, were many different peoples in the Andes. Minga is an ancestral practice where it takes precedence over anything else you're doing. When you call for a Minga, you call for a collective action to achieve a common good. It could be a construction of a road, a building of a house, but it can also be, and it is lately, the organizing to face and transform social conditions. Mingas have led to the Congress of the People, with an agenda to transform reality and society. And during the early 2000s, 2003, 2004, these Mingas became national social movements from the indigenous peoples of the region of Cauca, near the border with Ecuador. So the Mingas were called, I think it's important to share this with you. We covered the entire territory. We walked community by community under a mandate, collective mandate, and to call for a Minga. And the Minga was called a massive national mobilization on 5 points that came from the people. And the 5 points were: 1, the economic model is the problem globally. Unless we overcome the economic model, there won't be peace, there won't be any change. Number 2, the terror and war and are instruments of that model, and we have to see them that way. We can't achieve peace through a ceasefire. We have to achieve peace within the context of destroying an instrument of the economic model. And so it's not the protection and denouncing human rights abuses. That is limited. What we have to do is defend life as a whole against an economic model. Don't isolate human rights defense from the transformation of society. The third one is the legal system and the state institutions legislate to dispossess. In principle, they are at the service of the state. And so they will not produce legislation for the people. Even when we achieve a law that is of benefit to us, the usual is that law is alone, isolated within a whole legal system. So it's a little battle that we won. And in fact, it's trapped inside there, and it makes us defend the legal system that exists against us rather than transform the system. So giving us a little bit of a law with our struggle is it could actually work for the worst. Only as a fourth point in our Minga was obtaining certain things from the state. The fourth point was education, housing, hospitals, healthcare. We used to mobilize for this fourth point, not for the first three that I mentioned. Now we learn to mobilize for the structural reasons and then demand that the governments and the states keep to their commitments that we've won before. But the fifth point is the most important to us. We have to weave a new society collectively. And that cannot be done by the state or by anyone that represents us. So that knitting of a new society, we have to get going. And we don't ask the state for this. So we have to organize a Congress of the people, a Minga of the people, so that we, no matter how long it takes us, it is us who build something beyond the state and closer to us. That was the Minga agenda, 5 points. That Minga agenda was actually ignored something huge that you mentioned, and I'm using this, Fatma, to mention it. We did not acknowledge patriarchy. We didn't. It is thanks to the presence of the Kurdish struggle and are learning from the Kurdish struggle and Öcalan and what we've been able to learn, that we recognized for the longest period of time during the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, we ignored patriarchy. And we can't ignore patriarchy to achieve anything. We can't. So it's a huge point, and we're far away from acknowledging sufficiently patriarchy to overcome it. So it's a major problem. It's a huge difficulty. Now, I wanted to clarify that we didn't. What happened is this: the system forced us to do poor medicine for the poor and then live under awful conditions, or to get into the privilege of specialized medical or nursing practice and then turn our backs on people and be wealthy. The reason why I went into exile was not only because I worked with the poor, but because I was part of movements and processes that worked. And people actually proved that the collective health processes were not poor medicine for the poor, but were actually alternatives to the existing system. And the pandemic, COVID, I mentioned it, I think, in the paper a little bit. The pandemic was extraordinary in that regard. The territories that isolated themselves during the pandemic were the territories where the living conditions for people were better, and where we didn't depend on the national healthcare system and the charity system and so on. So that's, to give you an idea, the exile was because of the collective popular organization and not just because of working with the poor, for the poor. So that, I hope that clarifies the whole situation. Now, land reform. No, it hasn't happened. The main point of the peace agreement that was signed, the first point of the agreement, was massive land reform. And I am one of the ones that is convinced that if there is land reform in Colombia, a peace process will actually begin and happen strongly. Land is the key issue for peace and social transformation. It hasn't happened. What the government did was, during the peace negotiations, it passed legislation. And the legislation it passed conditioned the delivery of the redistribution of land to making that land productive within the capitalist productive mode of production. So if the land delivered to the poor or to those in need or to those who had been deprived of land was not placed within the capitalist system, that land would be removed from them and returned to the big landowners that were chained to the transnational corporation. With that legislation, they had achieved in practice, before the peace agreement was signed, a failure of the land reform and of the peace agreement. So your question is key, and it's very important. What are and I will pose this question as a question for you to, I'm sure you're discussing it, but it's very important. What are the key reforms, even reforms, or the key points to be achieved in the peace negotiations that will guarantee that you have a floor from which real peace will be achieved? In our case, the key point was true land reform, not just distributing land, but also providing the conditions of production, transformation, feeding people. If that could happen, then the peace agreement would be useful, even if no other point would be achieved. So my question, following the process or trying to follow the process in Turkey and the Middle East, is the Kurdish proposal is, yes, peace in general, no war in general, but which specific changes would constitute a solid ground that would guarantee that peace would continue to become even stronger and social transformation? Which ones? Rather than the rhetoric of the big issues, what concrete changes In our case, land reform. It didn't happen. We knew we weren't going to have peace. In your case, what are they? And I'm not answering the question, I'm just posing it to you, because we will never achieve peace until there are certain things, priorities that we can achieve. Colombia is the country in this, if you combine the dictatorships in the Southern Cone, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, and the number of people disappeared during the dictatorships there, Colombia alone had 3 times the number of disappeared people during those conflicts, during those dictatorships combined. So that gives you the magnitude of the horror here to maintain this genocidal democracy. This is the most violent country in this continent, this one and Guatemala. Why? Because it is the strongest one in social resistance and in social alternatives. They need horror to keep us the way we are. The other thing, now the question that Dylan, Dylan made on the peace process. Now, and regarding of what we see here from here in what's going on there. I have questions there, not answers, but these are some of the questions we have. The first one is, we need spaces like this one where we can engage in good, solid discussions comparing peace processes. We don't need to be told in principle what the purpose of the peace process is. That's good enough. We understand it. We understood Apo's statements, and we listen to them and we hear. We want to go beyond, and we want to say, look, in practice, after something like that happened here, this is what went on. What are the US and Israel planning to do with Turkey or against Turkey in this process? What possibilities are there to achieve peace through a congressional process, giving the priority to the Dem Party, for example? Does it tie the whole process to an institutional peace? Can one achieve peace through an institutional process? I don't have the answers, but we have the experience in our continent. And we know that. And then one question that I leave with you that I think is our huge question. FARC and the Colombian government, the guerrillas in Guatemala and the Guatemalan government, Salvador, FSLN and FMLN and the government had a commitment to a peace process from the government, even if not believable, concrete commitment when they started negotiation. We don't see that commitment there. We don't see a commitment from the government. We see hints. We see Bechet, I don't know how you pronounce that name, but so our question is, if we didn't achieve much in a context where there was a commitment and the government actually needed peace because the uprising was growing, then when you don't have a minimal commitment from the government, how can you achieve a transformation? One reason, I think, I may be wrong, is that the strength of the popular movement of the Kurdish people, that force may be what you're banking on to achieve changes. But that is one of our huge questions. So what are the conditions that would make you think that you're advancing, and what conditions should you achieve in order to arrive there? My proposal is that we engage in different environments in discussions deeper than this one on the peace processes, because we see the hand of the US and what it has learned from Latin America behind what's going on in Turkey. And I think there's a lot of their model to manipulate the peace process there. We may be wrong, but it would be useful to have that discussion rather than be told again and again the paradigm and read again the statement by Apple. We need, I think, an exchange, a reciprocal exchange to learn. Now, about tactical relationship with the state, with Mehmet, I think what you said is absolutely clear. The communal society as a goal, as an achievement, as the starting point and the end point, natural society, in the context of growing war and plutocracies and so on, that is the only way out. And the work of Öcalan and the discussions around this and genealogy and other things, plus many of the things that have been developed in Latin America, are extremely important as objective situations to be achieved, to be reached, horizons. Then where we would grow would be in learning how to get there from here, under your specific conditions in the Middle East now. Yes, reaching communal society. Yes, overcoming the state. But one can't overcome the state today. One has to go through it. But how does one not get trapped into the state during the process? And how does one go into communal society? You have Rojava. You have some things to show that are not just theories. But then it is extremely important, not only for you, but for all of us everywhere, that communal society is not just a statement, but goes to the tactical relationship with the state, and so that you don't lose sight of achieving that. I don't know if I've answered, but that's more or less the idea. Then, the commissions and the peace process. Thank you. Aije, I don't know if you pronounce that way your name, but thank you for following the process, and that allows me to say some of the things. In fact, there is an image of commissions taking part in the peace negotiations. It was a manipulation. The commanders negotiated until the final draft was almost ready. The pressure from communities, women's movements, Afro-Colombian movements, indigenous movements, and others, feeling completely excluded from the peace negotiations, led to, at the very end, when the draft was ready, to invite commissions, and the only component against patriarchy in the peace agreement in Colombia is a gender language component. No confrontation of the patriarchal structure. What they did is write men and women in masculine and feminine, but it was just makeup. There was nothing profound. Same with indigenous, same with Afro-Colombians. In fact, our position was that we should not have gone to Havana under those conditions. Let them sign their agreement and open space for us as people to develop our position. You negotiate your ceasefire up there and your reforms. That will open space, and then respect people, so that we construct the society we want. So what fits into the negotiations and what should go to the people? That's a huge question. And I think it was a big mistake to sit there and sign as women, as Afro-Colombians, as indigenous, as part of an agreement that wasn't ours and was not developed by us. It was theirs. So I think that point is important. Now, of course, once the peace agreement is signed, not only does the government not keep to the agreement, but begins to kill demobilized commanders and guerrilla members, and begins to kill those who abide by the peace agreement and are looking for social transformations. But those that incorporate themselves into the state, they don't touch them. They're still alive and they're still okay. So it was a targeted attack against those who believed there would be a social transformation. And it's important, I'll mention now the referendum. There was a referendum on the peace, the last draft of the peace agreement. and the referendum was lost. The majority of the people in Colombia voted against the peace agreement. And they didn't vote against the peace agreement because they understood the peace agreement. Even if it was a bad one, we assumed everybody would vote yes to it. It was at least a ceasefire. They voted no because the fascists scared people, lying to them with a propaganda machinery that the peace agreement would deliver the country into stealing your little property, all kinds of lies, including the fact that everybody would be taught to become gay. All kinds of propaganda, lies, manipulations, and we lost the referendum. We lost it. And after it was lost, there were touch-ups that favored the right, and that's how the peace agreement came to be. So even the referendum we lost because the state machinery can scare most people to disagree with it, which also leads me to give you the question back. If a peace agreement is reached in Turkey, then if there is a referendum, the state will manipulate, and the fascists will manipulate people to vote against it. And then if it's left to a vote process, it's a disaster. It's very difficult to gain a majority when the state propaganda is on. But that's one of the scenarios we faced here. So most people did not endorse the peace agreement because they didn't understand it and because they were not involved in the peace agreement. It wasn't their agenda. It was the commander's agenda at the negotiating table. They were removed from it. So if people don't take part in the process, then whatever is signed is not by the people, and people, when they don't understand it, they can be manipulated one way or the other. What happened after the peace agreement is very important. I thank you for that question because it's key. People expected finally to receive something other than bullets, repression, and corruption from the state once the peace agreement was signed. The implementation of the peace agreement had billions of dollars coming from the European Union and other countries. That money flew into institutions and elites. And if you wanted something from the peace process, changes, etc., you had to compete through projects, and the state would fund your project. What they actually did was to transform social movements and processes into state agencies. We gained state mentalities. We started working as though we were functionaries of the state, as though we worked in the state. So I don't know if that gives you an idea, but it's very important. The state is not just the institutions, it's its mechanism. If once you're going to implement a peace agreement, you're going to have to follow the rules of the state, then you become the state. And that's the end of the peace process. Last week, we were at a meeting of political planning with people throughout Cauca, and we were doing strategic planning. Half of the group had to leave because a government agent called them and said they had to present a report of their progress by the next morning. End of the meeting, now you obey the times and the rules of the state. Those mechanisms belong to them. And if we don't break them, we follow them. Mohammed, the fascism character, the internationalism here is weak. It's not the majority. And we do have, our polarization is huge between a fascist minority with all the support, the resources, the media, all the support from transnational corporations, the US, etc., and the economic power, but they're a minority. And the majority of people who increasingly, particularly after the uprisings of 2019 to 2021, are increasingly against the fascist model. But that polarization is there. So how do they, the fascists, try to gain power? Through fear. There's a bomb and 40 civilians were killed in the city of Cali next to a police station. We are certain that that bomb was placed by the army themselves or by the fascists themselves. Like that, I remember the one in Istanbul years ago. There's no doubt that whoever benefits from these attacks is the far right, because they promise order and they promise peace, the peace of a state that is strong. So what is happening here is exactly that. There's authoritarianism everywhere, but there's also, and that's where we are, right in the middle of this in Colombia. Last week there was a referendum to elect the candidate for the left in Colombia. And it was won with 2.5 million votes. Never a referendum had more than 700,000 votes. This one, 2.5 million. And the people elected somebody who's calm, who does not engage in smear politics of attacking the other one, who has been a victim of attacks and persecution, whose father was murdered by the fascists, and who has a program and refuses to discuss anything outside of programmatic social transformation lines. And people voted for him massively. So when this happens, the state has no option but to use repression, assassination, massacre to win, because whenever there's a discussion, they lose. And we can't lose sight of that, because that's where we are now. We have to force them into discussion. If we do, we win. And that's very, very interesting. I don't know what will happen, but it seems to be following that way. But going beyond the state, what has changed in the healthcare system? Actually changed for the worse. I have to tell you that I was Deputy Minister of Health in Colombia for a short period of time when M19, a demobilized guerrilla movement, obtained the Ministry of Health. And this is the one we wanted, the Ministry of Health, from there to achieve social transformation. So I was there. And we were doing something, I'll tell you, and this allows me to talk from the health perspective. What we proposed was this. We would take the 100 poorest municipalities in Colombia, and we would develop an approach to health that was based on the communities themselves. And the Ministry of Health, what we would do would be provide technical, fiscal support, but people themselves would run the system, learn to run it, guide it, organize it, and the ministry would come down from being the bureaucratic authority to becoming the supportive structure for people. This was through a negotiation with the World Bank to obtain resources to do this. I was involved in that awful stuff. We achieved the resources, and we were about to begin this process, and that's when the government gave an authoritarian coup, destroyed our proposal, but the names we gave to the different structures for those municipalities, they took those names. So the essential component of the healthcare system in Colombia are the health promotion structures, EPSs, health promotion structures. What they did was this, so that this is how wicked they are. They calculated how much money people in Colombia spend in health. And they discovered the expenditure in health in Colombia was higher than any other country in Latin America. You go to the drugstore for everything, you visit a doctor, etc. So it was so they made a calculation in money, econometrics. And they said, this is a huge amount of money. Now, if we transformed half of that money into a national fund for healthcare, it would be a huge amount of money. And if this money was captured from people ahead, like an insurance payment you have to make, then we would have a bag of money that we could transfer into private insurance companies and financial system and actually use the healthcare process to finance the financial sectors. So they created a healthcare system based on private institutions that captured by mandate resources from the middle classes, some from the wealthy, some from the poor, and then a little package of that, pocket of that was provided by the state to them as well. The healthcare system in Colombia, since it was established, killed more people than the armed conflict. If you go with a disease that really needs health care, cancer, cardiac surgery, complex that are expensive, the system has in place mechanisms so that you cannot access what you need. All kinds of obstacles to reach that. But if you go for a delivery, you go for a cold that will disappear on its own, etc., they look after you and they bill. Not only that, more than 50,000 dead people underwent procedures, and these private companies billed the state for these procedures on dead people. That system is still in place. It's still there, and this government tried to reform that system, but they're so powerful they can't get rid of it. So we were worse than the charity hospitals. They used health to transfer funds to a private system. And that's where we are now, trying to reform that system, and they don't allow it to happen. A couple more, I think I had. In terms of the destructive character, what we've heard and what we know about the Kurdish struggle is exactly the awareness of the fact that it shouldn't infect the people, and that everything consciously was done for it to be a defensive war and not a war of conquest. And Öcalan is very clear about this. This was not the case here. It wasn't. It was the power, taking over power to become like them. Here, the armed insurgencies aimed to do that. There, it was with the people to resist and defend the right to exist. Now, my question, and it's a question not only I asked, but many of the friends of the Kurdish struggle in Latin America, in Abya Yala, ask. So, okay, you end the PKK, you stop the war in order to stop the denigration that the war leads to, and you move ahead in order to force the state to remove itself from war. That's in principle the proposal. Our questions begin there in terms of how do you, in fact, pressure a state such as the Turkish state, the second largest NATO army in the world, to actually become interested in peace. And we have an example right now in Colombia. President Petro, when he came to power, he wanted total peace, even with these dissidents involved in drug trade. And he offered to negotiate with all of them. And just like Öcalan, he didn't wait for them to disarm and then we'll talk. He said, we'll talk now, peace. And those of you who are criminals will pay for your crimes, but you'll have decrease or less punishments if you are willing to leave your weapons and so on. And those of you who are political, you'll make political gains for the people in a peace negotiation. Nothing of that worked. In fact, we're worse off because all of these armed groups make more money if they remain inside the war. And there was no advantage to them that they could see in the peace process. So how convincing is to propose peace to these kind of people? And how can you convince them? You'd have to have massive support, global support. But it's a question. I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm just saying there are conditions for it to work. So what achievements from the peace process? So far, none. So far, I can say we haven't achieved anything through the peace process. No, there were 3 years of relative peace that we had never experienced before in our lives, and we were happy. And we thought this, but after 3 years, we don't have two armies. We don't have just the fascist repressive state. We have hundreds of them everywhere, and we used to be involved in negotiations. We can't negotiate now because the commander is making money through drug trade and so on. So the peace from the bottom, the construction of peace from the bottom, my feeling is this, and I hope this is the case that can develop in Turkey and the Middle East now.